So the next speaker is Tin Maung Maung Ai, aka Tim I Hardy. He relocated to the US after he was forced to leave Yangon because of his involvement in the 8888 nationwide uprising in 1989. He attended California Polytechnic University at Pomona and San Diego State University, completing a master's degree in computer science. At the same time, he was actively involved in various human rights issues and initiatives around the world, particularly in northern Uganda and Sudan. He chaired the Global Intergenerational Leadership Forum by UNESCO on comparative human rights for 10 years. He worked as a computer scientist for a number of years in the US before returning to Myanmar in late 2014 to set up Myanmar Mobile Education Project. He is currently working closely with the Ministry of Education in supporting and coordinating on the implementation of National Education Strategic Plan 2016-2021, and his presentation today is Mosaic Democracy, Education Reform in Transition. Can we welcome Tim I Hardy? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for staying after delicious lunch. I was sort of like expecting more like a Burmese audience, but I guess I will tweak a little bit my presentation. Can you just Paul mentioned like the topic that I'd like to discuss, more like a roundtable discussion than presentation, is mosaic democracy, because my background is not journalism or any sort of like a media. Most like I'm an activist involved in many years of anti-military movement back in the United States. Came here and then now involved with education, and then I will share the connection between the education system that we have and then democracy, and then how these two related, and then maybe point out some of the undemocratic components in our constitutions, and then how far we have come, and then how much longer we have to go. So that will be my presentation sharing. So I title my topic as a mosaic democracy. So like when we talk about democracy, most of the time we see as a whole, as a society, as a country that gone through the transition. So in Myanmar is a different situation. International community, some folks outside may think that we're going through as a one entity, as a country, as a society. But in reality, there's many components during this democratic transition. So to begin with, like what's the definition of democracy? Which we don't need to preach democracy to French, right? Because this is almost like a birth of the democracy. We can go back all the way to Greek and then all the different old civilization, but modern civilization in society, that's what the French is pretty much forefront of the democracy. So, mainly two types, direct democracy and the indirect democracy. Yes, thank you, Paul, Theo. So, direct democracy, you guys already know, where citizens pretty much involved in not only not having a representative, it's just directly discussing, forming all the solutions for some of the issues that are relevant to the citizens, to the public. So what we have here is more constitutional democracy, representative democracy here in Myanmar. So in that sense, the education system of the country and the citizens, it's quite critical in order for us to move forward with this democratic transition, because people will have a choice. The main component of a democracy is a voting election process. So how do we do this voting and election process when we had almost 5 decades of repressive and authoritarian and then military rules, where the education system is pretty much sidelined, dysfunctional, unfunded. So that's where we are right now. So we'll talk about democracy and the education. So first, you see how do we define democracy? And there's two types that I mentioned. Because of the second type, the outcomes is a bit unsure, because you have many people involved in the system that with many different interests. So when people vote, you don't really know what will be the final outcome, because all the interests and everything has to be included. So that's what forcing us to work together, struggle together for the common and then collective interest to be served. We're just in the very early stage of that process. So, and then if you look at the Constitution, constitutional democracy pretty much limits the majority interests while protecting the minorities. That's how democracy should be. A lot of people understand the democracy as a majority rules, but the key is in the Constitution. So when we're talking about protecting the rights of minorities and others, how do we do that in a democratic society? It's pretty much some of the basic principles. You have UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So 30 articles. So every single human beings were pretty much born with those, right? And then you have minority rights. You have other freedom of expression, freedom of press, freedom of assembly. So those are the rights that guarantee the individual rights, and then these are the ones that protecting minorities in a sense. So if we look at Myanmar case, we can go a bit, we can define the protection of minority in another dimension, because this constitution is also protecting those who have ruled the country in the past. So in the current constitutions, there's a provision that saying before the transition, any crimes that committed, any individual that done any wrongdoings cannot be prosecuted, cannot be revisited. This is the provision that clearly indicated, mentioned in the current constitution. So when we talk about protection of minority, we're not talking about protection of those religion groups and ethnic groups and the other, minority in the other groups. So we're talking about those as well, which is stated in the Constitution. So this is something that we need to be mindful about. Who are we protecting with this current Constitution, with this current process of going through this, transition? I don't want to get into too much detail about who these people were, what they have done, who are the folks that are running the country in terms of managing and then controlling the economy and everything. These are well documented, and then you can find it anywhere. But what I'm trying to point out is that how far do we need to go when we define this protection of minority groups? Are they included? That's something for us to think about, right? And Larry Diamonds, most of you know that he's a well-known political professor in Stanford University that defined there's 4 major elements that any democratic society or elements of the democracy. So you can see clearly that first is the system. You must have a system that allows citizens to vote in a free and fair election. And second thing is a active participation of the citizens. How engaged the citizens are in these elections and the voting, right, process. And the third one is the promotion of the human rights. So democratic society must guarantee the protection of human rights to anybody, regardless of race and then backgrounds and ethnicity, or whether they're rich or poor, or whether they're black or white or yellow, whatever color they are. And the third one is the rule of law for all citizens, not just for those special interest group or particular, individuals. So those are the four major elements that we all know that any democratic society should uphold these values. But when we look at Myanmar case, voting, let's talk about voting and then choosing and replacing the government. How far we have come is you can look back decades of military and then authoritarian rule. But even in the current situation, when we talk about freedom of elections or voting, Constitution's already limited that 25% of the parliamentary seats in both in the union level and the sub-union and the national levels are appointed by the military chief of staff. So we currently have active military members sitting at the parliament. 25% of the seats are being taken by those individuals. So when we talk about voting, this group is not included to begin with, right? So that's something for us to reflect on, right? When we talk about the voting and then when we talk about electing the new government, we have already been sort of like a segregated or like a already been disassociated with the 100% part of it, right? And the second part of it, when you look at it, the other part of the sort of like a democracy is already been excluded in terms of we also have like 3 different ministries. The ministers of those ministries are pretty much recommended or appointed by the military chief of staff. So those 3 ministers are not appointed by the president, who is also elected by the parliament through those majority votes, because 75% has already been, only the 75% is free and fair, so to speak. So those 3 positions of the government are directly under those restricted sort of the component of the Constitution, right? So this is something that we need to think about, right, when we talk about democracy and then transition. And then also when we talk about protection of the minority, we're not talking about other rights. Mainly we're talking about the minority and the ethnic groups. Myanmar consists of 135 different ethnic groups. This is legally defined in the Constitution, right? And some of the major ethnic groups have been fighting against the central government since 1948 when we got the independence from the British. So they're still fighting. So those areas, citizens of those areas and then citizens who belong to those minority groups are not part of this process that we're calling the democratization process. So, and then the last part, that when we talk about the protection of the human rights and then for all citizens, so we need to be mindful of those individuals and the groups are already isolated, already been excluded by the current Constitution. So in our case, how are we considering and then incorporating the rights of those individuals who belong to those ethnic groups and then other marginalized groups are not on the same page with the current transition. So there are many of them. That's why when they take the census in 2014, a lot of groups are not counted. That's why population of the Myanmar is only about 53 million shown up. So this is the unofficial population. It's a lot more than that. So there's a lot more that we can get into in terms of the peace process that we're going through, national ceasefire agreements that some ethnic groups and the armed groups already signed up. So a few groups are still negotiating. Some of them are very powerful in the northern Myanmar with about over 20,000 strong armed forces. KIA and then Wa ethnic groups and other groups are still fighting out there. So for us, when we talk about democracy in Myanmar, I feel like those are the components that we need to really consider. Even within the elected government, they are pretty much functioning in a very tight, boundaries and areas. So, and then we have to ask ourselves how much freedom that we have, and then what are the causes of some of the challenges that we're facing when we talk about freedom of press, and then when we talk about journalists being arrested. So we need to really look into a little bit deeper into the structures and then constitutions and then certain elements are how they are interacting, how they're working together or working not together. So I will get into a little bit about education. Before that, the last element that I want to touch is like a rule of law, right? When we talk about rule of law, those elements must come to play because rule of law means like it applies to everybody, all citizens. So if you have selective sort of like enforcement, that will trigger the subjective sort of like a action by the authority, which will create unrest. Some groups may not be happy, and that will also trigger a lot more complicated situations. So this is something that we're seeing as we're moving through this transition. So when we talk about reforming the country, rebuilding the society, there are three elements I feel like we need to really fulfill simultaneously. So capacity of the individuals who are in this country. We talk about the citizens. So when we talk about citizens, we talk about education. What sort of education system that they were getting in the last 20, 30 years. Education system directly responsible for the developing the values and the principles of democracy. Because democracy means you also have some roles and responsibility as citizens to take on, right? You also have to be aware of others who are also in the similar situations you are. And then you also be aware of the rights. How do we protect them? In that sense, citizens also have the responsibility to make it happen. But education system it's intimately responsible for that, delivering all of that. So three things that I like to mention. The first is capacity and the education of those individuals in a society needs to be in a certain level that be able to make those choices. If you look at a family, when you can't give choices to your sons and daughter when they are still in a very young age. You need to have certain restrictions that you cannot eat this, you cannot have this more than how much, because they themselves are not ready to make that sort of choices. That's why we need to have an education system that be able to foster and provide that sort of knowledge and understanding. The second thing is the system itself needs to be transformed. So when you have individuals learning new things and gaining new knowledge and education and understanding, but the system and the environment still old system that, waiting for some sort of directions in order to respond, then things that you have accumulated and acquire will not be able to exercise. So the environment needs to be changed, system needs to be changed at the same time while we're educating citizens and an individual within the system. The last is the leadership. So the leadership has to be also fully engaged and then mindful of all those two things need to be happening at the same time. But in Myanmar, current moment, what we have seen is we're facing a lot of challenges, not only in terms of simultaneously this like a multi-stakeholder transition. This is something that we need to understand. This is something we need to be able to work with other stakeholders, including the international community, also with the domestic development partners and the CSOs and the government, for us to have those three transformational changes happen at the same time. So I will just conclude here, and then that will trigger more like freedom of press and expressions, other things that we can discuss hopefully in the Q&A session. Thank you.